The night was still, and young Samuel lay quietly in the temple, unaware that his world was about to change forever. In the silence, a voice called his name, once, twice, 3 times, yet Samuel had no idea who was speaking to him. He rushed to Eli, confused, only to be told that the priest had not summoned him. But something greater was at work in the shadows of that temple. Could it be that the Almighty was breaking his silence and speaking to a child? Imagine the tension in Samuel's heart as he lay back down, not knowing if the voice would call again. What would you do if you suddenly realized God was calling your name? Samuel, a mere boy, was about to encounter the voice of the Creator in a way that would alter the course of his life and the fate of a nation. But what could a child do with such a revelation? And how would Samuel respond to a call that demanded everything from him? Israel was experiencing a profound spiritual silence. In a time when visions and divine messages were rare, the nation had lost much of its spiritual direction. Eli, the high priest, was aging, and his sons, who should have carried on his legacy, were corrupt and leading the people astray. The spiritual leadership of Israel was failing, and the people suffered as a result. There was a deep longing for guidance, but the voice of God seemed distant and quiet, leaving Israel in darkness. This spiritual silence was not just a punishment. It was also a period of waiting. God was preparing something, or rather someone, to restore his voice to the people. Israel's leadership had grown complacent, and its people were suffering from the lack of divine guidance. The land was crying out for a prophet, someone who could hear God's voice and bring his message to the people. But who would rise to this call? The silence was a precursor to something miraculous. Amidst this silence, there was a child, a boy named Samuel, who had been dedicated to the Lord by his mother Hannah. Samuel lived in the temple, serving under the watchful eye of Eli, unaware that his destiny would be far greater than anyone could have imagined. Little did Samuel know, the silence that surrounded him was about to be broken, and he would be the vessel through which God would speak once again to his people. The contrast between the silence of Israel and what was about to happen creates a powerful tension. For years, the people had not heard from God, and spiritual leaders like Eli were losing their effectiveness. Yet in the midst of this silence, God was preparing to speak. But instead of choosing an experienced priest or elder, God was about to call upon the heart of a child. The anticipation builds as we await how this divine intervention will unfold. Eli, though a priest, had become passive in his spiritual leadership. His sons had abused their positions, and Eli had failed to correct them. The lack of accountability and righteousness in the temple leadership mirrored the spiritual state of the nation. In many ways, Israel's silence was self-imposed. Its leaders were disconnected from God, and the people had grown accustomed to a world where God's voice was distant. But this silence would not last forever. Israel's history had been marked by the guidance of prophets and judges who acted as intermediaries between God and his people. But this prophetic voice had faded, and without it, the nation was floundering. The people needed someone to restore the connection to God, someone to speak his words of truth and judgment. God, however, would choose an unlikely candidate, someone who was pure and untainted by the corruption of the current leadership. This setting, this spiritual drought, was the perfect backdrop for what God was about to do. He would not choose a seasoned priest or a righteous elder, he would call a child. And in this unexpected move, God would demonstrate that he can work through anyone, regardless of age or status. The silence in Israel was about to be shattered, and it would begin with the voice of a child who had never before heard the Lord's call. The spiritual silence that had plagued Israel for so long was not a sign of God's absence, but a sign that he was waiting for the right moment. The anticipation of what was to come builds with each passing moment, as we prepare to witness one of the most profound calls in the Bible. The story of Samuel reminds us that even in times of spiritual drought, God is always preparing to speak, often through the most unexpected of vessels. Samuel's life was marked by devotion from the very beginning. His mother, Hannah, had prayed desperately for a child, and when Samuel was born, she kept her promise to dedicate him to the Lord. From a young age, Samuel lived in the temple under the care of Eli, the high priest. He spent his days serving faithfully, unaware of the great plans that God had for him. In the eyes of others, Samuel was just a boy, but in the eyes of God, he was a chosen vessel. Samuel's daily life was simple yet meaningful. He carried out tasks in the temple, learning the ways of worship and service. Although he was young, his heart was pure and his devotion was genuine. While Eli's sons were corrupt and self-serving, Samuel quietly served, growing in the knowledge of God's ways. His innocence and humility made him the perfect candidate for the work that God was preparing to do. Samuel's faithfulness in small things was about to open the door to something much greater. It is remarkable how God often chooses the least likely individuals to carry out his plans. Samuel was not a priest, nor was he trained in the prophetic arts. He was simply a boy who lived in the temple, serving under the authority of Eli. Yet in the midst of this simplicity, God saw something special in Samuel, a heart that was open, a spirit that was willing. Samuel's life in the temple was not just preparation for service, it was preparation for a divine encounter. Samuel's relationship with Eli was also significant. Though Eli was no longer as spiritually sharp as he once was, he still played a critical role in guiding Samuel. Eli may have been losing touch with God, but he still had enough wisdom to recognize when God was calling Samuel. Their relationship serves as a reminder that even flawed leaders can still play an important role in mentoring the next generation. Eli, despite his failings, was instrumental in helping Samuel recognize the voice of God. As Samuel served in the temple, he was unaware of the spiritual decay around him. He had no part in the corruption of Eli's sons, and his innocence kept him close to God's heart. It's often in the quiet, unnoticed places where God prepares his servants for great things. Samuel's humility and obedience were his greatest assets, and though he didn't know it, they were what qualified him for the calling that was about to come. Samuel's childhood in the temple stands in contrast to the leadership around him. While Eli's sons abused their power, Samuel quietly served with integrity. This contrast sets the stage for the spiritual shift that was about to occur. God was about to raise up a new leader, someone who would listen to his voice and lead Israel in righteousness. But first, Samuel would need to learn to hear God's voice for himself. The simplicity of Samuel's life in the temple is a reminder that God often works through the ordinary and the unnoticed. Samuel wasn't seeking greatness, he was simply serving where he had been placed. And it was in this place of humility that God chose to speak to him. Samuel's story shows us that greatness in God's kingdom is often found in the most unexpected places and through the most humble of servants. In today's world, we are often tempted to seek recognition and success. But Samuel's life reminds us that it is in the quiet places of service that God prepares us for greater things. We don't need to chase after positions of power or influence. God will find us where we are, just as he found Samuel in the temple. Samuel's humble service was the foundation for the incredible calling that was about to come. It was a quiet night in the temple, and Samuel had laid down to sleep. The stillness of the night was interrupted by a voice calling his name, Samuel. Startled, Samuel awoke and ran to Eli, thinking that the priest had called him. But Eli was confused, for he had not called Samuel. "Go back and lie down," Eli said. Obediently, Samuel returned to his bed, still unaware that it was not Eli, but God, who had called him. The voice came again, "Samuel." Once more, Samuel rose and ran to Eli, convinced that the priest needed him. Again, Eli told him that he had not called. The confusion must have been growing in Samuel's heart. Who was calling him? Why did the voice seem so real? The mystery deepened as the night wore on, and Samuel's response to the call remained the same. Faithful and immediate, but still lacking understanding of who was truly speaking to him. The third time the voice called, "Samuel," the young boy once again ran to Eli. By now the confusion was palpable. Eli, who had long served as Israel's high priest, suddenly realized what was happening. It was not a human voice that Samuel had been hearing, it was the voice of the Lord. Eli, with all his spiritual wariness, still had the wisdom to recognize when God was at work. He instructed Samuel to return to bed, and if the voice called again, to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Eli's realization was a turning point. Despite his own spiritual decline, Eli still had the discernment to guide Samuel toward recognizing the voice of God. In that moment, Eli passed on a critical piece of wisdom to the young boy. When God speaks, you must listen. The suspense builds as Samuel prepares himself for what could be the most important moment of his life. The boy who had faithfully served in the temple was now on the verge of hearing directly from the Creator of the universe. Samuel returned to his bed, but this time, everything was different. Now he knew that the voice calling him was not Eli's, but the Lord's. The anticipation must have been overwhelming. Would the voice come again? What would God say? As Samuel lay in the quiet of the night, waiting for the voice to return, the atmosphere was charged with suspense. The next time Samuel heard his name, he would know exactly what to do. For a young boy, the experience of hearing God's voice must have been both thrilling and terrifying. Samuel had grown up in the temple, serving God in practical ways, but this was something entirely different. This was a direct encounter with the divine. The significance of the moment was not lost on Samuel. Though he was young, he understood that this was no ordinary experience. God was calling him, and he needed to be ready to respond. The voice of God came again. "Samuel, Samuel." This time Samuel was prepared. With humility and reverence he responded, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." In that moment, the silence of Israel was broken. God had found a servant who was ready to hear his voice, and Samuel's life would never be the same. The call that Samuel received that night would set the course for the rest of his life, as he stepped into his destiny as a prophet of the Lord. This moment of Samuel hearing God's voice reminds us that God often speaks in the quiet moments of life, when we least expect it. It's easy to overlook the significance of Samuel's response, but his willingness to listen is what set him apart. God wasn't looking for someone with power or prestige. He was looking for someone who would say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And in Samuel, God found exactly that. When Eli realized that it was God calling Samuel, everything changed. Despite Eli's failures as a father and spiritual leader, he had the wisdom to guide Samuel in this critical moment. Eli's instruction was simple yet profound. "If he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Eli, who had once heard from God in his own life, recognized that the torch was being passed to the next generation, and Samuel was about to step into his divine calling. Samuel's response to Eli's guidance was immediate and obedient. He trusted Eli's wisdom and prepared himself for what was to come. As he lay back down in the temple, his heart must have been racing. What would God say? What would this divine encounter mean for his future? The anticipation grew with each passing moment, and Samuel's faithfulness was about to be rewarded. His willingness to listen would soon be met with a revelation from God himself. When God called Samuel's name again, the young boy was ready. His response, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," was filled with humility and openness. Samuel didn't know what God was about to reveal, but he was ready to listen, ready to receive whatever message the Lord had for him. This moment marked the beginning of Samuel's prophetic ministry. In a time of spiritual darkness, God had found a servant who was willing to hear his voice and act upon it. Samuel's response is a powerful example of what it means to be open to God's call. He didn't hesitate, and he didn't question the voice he heard. Instead, he humbly positioned himself to receive whatever God had to say. This is the kind of posture that God looks for in his servants, a heart that is ready to listen and a spirit that is willing to obey. Samuel's willingness to listen opened the door for God to use him in powerful ways. Eli's role in this moment cannot be overlooked. Though he had failed in many areas of his life, he still had the spiritual discernment to guide Samuel toward recognizing God's voice. Eli's mentorship, even in his spiritual decline, was crucial in helping Samuel understand the significance of what was happening. This relationship between Eli and Samuel serves as a reminder that even flawed leaders can still play a vital role in nurturing the next generation of spiritual leaders. Samuel's response, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," is a phrase that has echoed throughout the ages. It is the response that every believer should have when they hear the call of God. Samuel's willingness to listen, despite his youth and inexperience, set him apart as a servant of the Lord. This simple phrase encapsulates the heart of a true servant, one who is not only willing to serve, but also eager to hear the voice of the Master. The relationship between Eli and Samuel also highlights the importance of spiritual mentorship. Eli's guidance helped Samuel discern God's voice, and this mentorship was crucial in Samuel's development as a prophet. While Eli's own spiritual life was in decline, his role as a mentor to Samuel was invaluable. This teaches us that even in our imperfections, we can still guide others toward God's call. Eli's instruction, though simple, prepared Samuel for a lifetime of hearing and delivering God's messages. Samuel's response to God's call marked a turning point in his life. No longer was he just a boy serving in the temple. He was now a prophet in the making, a young servant ready to carry out God's will. This moment of revelation would shape the rest of Samuel's life as he stepped into his divine purpose. The boy who had once served in silence was now listening to the voice of God, ready to deliver his messages to the people of Israel. When Samuel heard the voice of God calling his name for the fourth time, he was no longer confused or uncertain. This time, he knew it was the Lord speaking. With a heart full of reverence and anticipation, Samuel responded, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." In that moment, the silence that had enveloped Israel for so long was broken. God had found a faithful servant in Samuel, and he began to reveal his plans for the future of the nation. God's message to Samuel was not an easy one. The Lord spoke of judgment that was to come upon Eli's household because of the sins of his sons and Eli's failure to correct them. This must have been a heavy burden for Samuel, a young boy who had grown up under Eli's care. Yet, despite the weight of the message, Samuel listened attentively, recognizing that he was now a messenger of the Most High God. This encounter was a turning point in his life. As Samuel listened to God's words, the weight of his new responsibility began to settle on him. He was no longer just a boy serving in the temple. He was now a prophet, entrusted with delivering the very words of God. The revelation he received that night would shape the course of his ministry and the future of Israel. Though young, Samuel had been chosen by God to speak truth in a time of spiritual darkness, and his obedience and listening opened the door for God's continued revelation. The encounter between Samuel and God is a powerful reminder that God often speaks in unexpected ways and to unexpected people. Samuel was just a child, but God saw in him a heart that was ready to listen and obey. In a time when the spiritual leaders of Israel had grown complacent and corrupt, God bypassed the established hierarchy and chose a humble boy to carry his message. This shows us that God is not limited by our age, status, or experience. He looks for hearts that are open and willing. The message that God gave Samuel was a difficult one. It spoke of judgment, not only on Eli's sons, but on Eli himself for failing to restrain them. This was a heavy burden for a child to carry, especially considering his close relationship with Eli. Yet God's call to Samuel was not about comfort, it was about truth. Samuel's first prophetic message was a hard one, but it was a necessary one. The young boy who had faithfully served in the temple was now being called to speak difficult truths to a nation in need of repentance. The fact that God chose to speak directly to Samuel is a testament to the purity of Samuel's heart. While the older generation of priests had grown corrupt, Samuel's innocence and humility made him a perfect vessel for God's message. This encounter reminds us that God often speaks to those who are least expected, those who are not seeking power or prestige, but are simply serving faithfully where they are. Samuel's willingness to listen is what set him apart. This moment of divine revelation was the beginning of Samuel's prophetic ministry. From that night forward, God would continue to speak to Samuel, guiding him as he led Israel through times of crisis and transition. Samuel's encounter with God was not just a one-time event. It was the start of a lifelong relationship between the young prophet and the Almighty. Through Samuel, God would speak to kings and nations, delivering messages of judgment, hope, and redemption. Samuel's encounter with God also serves as a reminder that when we hear God's voice, we must be willing to act on what we hear. Samuel didn't just listen to God, he obeyed. He delivered the difficult message to Eli, even though it must have pained him to do so. This is the mark of a true servant of God, the willingness to not only hear God's voice, but to act on it, no matter how difficult the message may be. After Samuel's encounter with God, his life would never be the same. The young boy who had faithfully served in the temple now stepped into his role as a prophet, and all of Israel soon recognized the hand of God upon him. Samuel grew in wisdom and stature, and the Lord continued to speak to him, revealing his will for the nation. The people of Israel, once spiritually lost and directionless, now had a prophet to guide them, and Samuel's influence began to spread throughout the land. Samuel's rise as a prophet was not sudden, but it was steady. He continued to serve faithfully, and as he did, God's favor rested upon him. Unlike the sons of Eli, who sought to manipulate their position for personal gain, Samuel remained humble and devoted to God. His integrity and obedience set him apart, and it wasn't long before all of Israel knew that Samuel was a true prophet, one who spoke with the authority of God himself. The people of Israel had long been without a strong spiritual leader, and Samuel's rise to prominence came at a critical time. The nation was in need of direction, and God had provided that direction through Samuel. His reputation as a prophet grew, and soon, people from all over the land came to seek his counsel. Samuel's words carried weight because they were not his own. They were the words of God, delivered through a servant who was willing to listen and obey. As Samuel grew older, his role as a prophet expanded. He not only delivered messages from God, but also became a judge over Israel, helping to settle disputes and guide the nation in matters of justice. Samuel's influence was far-reaching, and his leadership helped to bring a measure of peace and stability to a nation that had long been in spiritual and moral decline. Through Samuel, God was restoring order to Israel, and the nation began to turn back to the Lord. One of the most significant aspects of Samuel's rise as a prophet was his ability to hear God's voice clearly. In a time when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel's relationship with God was a beacon of light in the darkness. He didn't seek to elevate himself or his own opinions, he simply delivered what God had spoken. This humility and faithfulness made Samuel one of the most respected and revered prophets in Israel's history. Samuel's rise to prominence was a direct result of his willingness to listen to God's voice and act on it. From the moment he said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," Samuel's life became a testament to the power of obedience. He didn't seek to be a prophet or a judge, he simply sought to serve God, and in doing so, God elevated him to a position of great influence. Samuel's story reminds us that true greatness comes from humble service to the Lord. As Samuel's reputation grew, so did his influence over the people of Israel. He became a trusted voice, one that the nation could rely on for guidance and direction. Samuel's leadership was marked by integrity and devotion to God, and the people knew that when Samuel spoke, it was God who was speaking through him. This trust allowed Samuel to play a crucial role in the spiritual revival of Israel, leading the nation back to faithfulness to the Lord. Samuel's rise as a prophet was not just about his own personal success, it was about the restoration of a nation. Through Samuel, God was bringing his people back to himself, and the spiritual silence that had once plagued Israel was replaced by the clear and authoritative voice of the Lord. Samuel's willingness to listen to God not only changed his life, it changed the course of Israel's history. The boy who had once served in silence was now leading a nation with the voice of God. The story of Samuel's call is not just a historical account, it's a powerful reminder that God still speaks today. Just as he called Samuel in the quiet of the night, God continues to call his people, often in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. But are we listening? In a world filled with noise and distractions, it can be difficult to hear the voice of God. Yet, Samuel's story teaches us that God speaks to those who are willing to listen, even in the midst of chaos. Samuel's willingness to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," is a posture that we too must adopt if we want to hear from God. It's not enough to desire to hear his voice. We must be ready to act on what he says. Samuel's life was forever changed because he was not only willing to listen, but also willing to obey. Today, God is still looking for servants who will listen and respond to his call, just as Samuel did. In today's world, it can be easy to overlook the ways in which God speaks to us. We may not hear an audible voice like Samuel did, but God still communicates through his word, through prayer, and through the Holy Spirit. The question is, are we making space in our lives to hear him? Samuel's story challenges us to silence the distractions, to create moments of stillness where we can tune in to the voice of the Lord. God is speaking. Are we listening? One of the most profound lessons from Samuel's life is the importance of being ready to hear God's voice, no matter our age or status. Samuel was just a child when God called him, but his heart was open and willing. This teaches us that no matter where we are in life, we can position ourselves to hear from God. Whether we are young or old, experienced or inexperienced, God can use us if we are willing to listen and respond to his voice. Hearing God's voice is not always easy. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to act on what we hear. Samuel's story reminds us that God doesn't always speak in the ways we expect. Sometimes his voice comes in the stillness of the night, in a moment of quiet reflection, or through the words of a trusted mentor. The key is to remain open and attentive, always ready to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." The world we live in is full of noise, social media, news, entertainment, and constant distractions. In this environment, it can be challenging to hear the voice of God. Yet, just as Samuel heard God in the quiet of the temple, we too can hear him if we make space for stillness in our lives. God is not silent, he is always speaking. The question is, are we taking the time to listen? Samuel's story invites us to seek moments of quiet where we can tune in to the voice of God. One of the most practical ways we can position ourselves to hear God's voice is through prayer. Prayer is not just about talking to God, it's about listening. Samuel's response to God's call was one of listening, and that is the posture we must adopt in our own prayer lives. When we come before God in prayer, we should not only bring our requests but also ask, "Lord, what are you saying to me today?" God's voice may come as a whisper, but it is always there for those who are listening. In the end, the story of Samuel teaches us that hearing God's voice is not reserved for a select few. It is available to all who are willing to listen. God is always speaking, always calling his people to greater things. The question is, are we ready to respond? Like Samuel, we must be willing to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And when we do, we open ourselves up to the incredible work that God wants to do in and through us. Samuel's story is a powerful example of what it means to be ready for God's call. From a young age, Samuel was positioned in a place of service, and when God spoke, he was ready to respond. This teaches us that being ready for God's call is not about age or experience. It's about having a heart that is open and willing. Are we positioning ourselves in such a way that we can hear and respond to God's voice when he calls? In our busy modern lives, it can be easy to miss the voice of God. We get caught up in the noise of daily responsibilities, social media, and entertainment, leaving little room for the stillness required to hear God's call. But Samuel's story reminds us that God often speaks in the quiet moments, and we must be intentional about creating space for those moments in our lives. Are we willing to set aside the noise and distractions to listen for God's voice? One of the most important lessons from Samuel's life is the importance of being ready to act when God calls. It's not enough to hear his voice. We must also be willing to obey. Samuel's life was marked by obedience from the very beginning. When God called, Samuel didn't hesitate. He responded with humility and openness. This is the posture that we must adopt if we want to be used by God. Are we ready to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening"? Being ready for God's call also means being willing to step into the unknown. Samuel had no idea what God was going to say, but he was willing to listen and follow wherever God would lead. This kind of faith requires trust, a trust that God's plans are good and that he will guide us through whatever he calls us to do. Are we willing to step out in faith even when we don't know where God's call will take us? Samuel's story also teaches us that we don't have to be perfect to hear from God. Samuel was young and inexperienced, and Eli, his mentor, was flawed. Yet God still chose to speak to Samuel and use him in powerful ways. This is a reminder that God is not looking for perfection. He is looking for a heart that is willing. Are we willing to set aside our doubts and insecurities and trust that God can use us, flaws and all? The relationship between Samuel and Eli also highlights the importance of spiritual mentorship. Eli, despite his own failures, played a critical role in helping Samuel recognize God's voice. This teaches us that we too need mentors and guides who can help us discern God's call in our lives. Are we seeking out spiritual guidance, and are we open to the wisdom of those who have gone before us? In the end, being ready for God's call is about cultivating a heart that is open, humble, and willing to listen. Samuel's story reminds us that God can and will speak to those who are ready to hear him. But it is up to us to position ourselves in such a way that we are able to recognize his voice. Are we making space in our lives to hear from God, and are we prepared to respond when he calls? As we reflect on Samuel's story, we are left with a challenge. Are we ready to hear God's voice? Are we willing to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening"? If we are, then we open ourselves up to the incredible plans that God has for our lives. God is still calling his people today. Will you be ready to answer when he calls your name? The story of Samuel teaches us that God's voice doesn't always come in the ways we expect. And it doesn't matter how young or unprepared we feel. Samuel, a boy serving quietly in the temple, wasn't looking for greatness, yet God found him. Imagine what would happen if you opened your heart to hear his voice today. Is he calling you in the stillness of your life? Are you ready to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening"? Now is the time to silence the noise and distractions that drown out God's voice. Like Samuel, you might feel unqualified or too young in your faith, but God calls those who are willing. Will you be ready when he calls your name? Take a moment right now to quiet your heart and say, "Lord, I'm listening." Who knows what incredible plans he has for your life, just waiting for you to answer.